He was born and raised in Youngstown and received his Ph.D. in 1988 from the University of Toledo. He is an acclaimed classroom teacher who won the Distinguished Teacher Award at Kent State. He's written numerous scholarly and popular history articles and is the author or editor of 5 books, including 4 that deal primarily with music during the Depression era. They are Swing, the Modern Sound, the Cultural Context of Swing Music in America. All of this music belongs to the nation, the WPA's Federal Music Project and American Society, 1935 to 1939. America's Musical Pulse, Popular Music in 20th Century Society, and Research in Popular American Music. You therefore may not be particularly surprised to know that Dr. Bindas takes his music both seriously and personally. He plays the guitar and sings in an Akron area rock band called House of Popes. And if you want to pursue that, their website is houseofpopes.com. His new book, which is why he's here tonight, is Remembering the Great Depression in the Rural South. It's a collection of memories assembled nearly 20 years ago from hundreds of residents of central and southwestern Georgia and several other southern states. Dr. Bindas did not write the following specifically for that book, but it does connect to it in many ways. He wrote, and I quote, "Being born to a working-class family in Youngstown and witness to the Steel era decline in the 70s and 80s encouraged me to study the negotiation between government, business, and the people. Using culture, political, social, and popular, as the lens to view primarily the Depression era, my research and teaching has focused on how the people redefined themselves, their government, and business in this era of swirling change." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth J. Bindas.
Thank you. Thanks for that warm introduction. And thank you all for coming out, and the Georgia Center for the Books for inviting me down. It's quite an honor. I told all my colleagues I was on a book tour, and they were all jealous because they had never been on a big book tour like I had. The reason I published this book was really an accident. Most of my research, as Bill suggested, deals with popular culture and popular music primarily. But when I got the job in Georgia, I taught at West Georgia College, which is now the State University of West Georgia. When I got the job there, I really didn't have any idea what Southerners were. I was born and raised in Ohio, never really got outside of Ohio. And so when they hired me, I was a fresh new hire, and I really didn't know how to, connect with my students. I knew how to connect with urban working class kids, racially diverse, ethnically diverse, but the kids at West Georgia College didn't fit that model. So I thought the best way to do that was to hear stories. I'm a historian. I like telling stories. That's my lecture style, is to tell stories. And so what I thought would be a good assignment for them would be to interview their elders, interview people in their community, go to rest homes and home for older people, go to hospitals, go to wherever, and just talk to people. From my perspective, what I would get out of it is I would get to hear stories about the region, hear stories about what it was like to be in the South, what it was like to, grow up in this era. The questions I focused on when I created the database was on the Great Depression, because that's my area of expertise, and so I created questions that dealt with Roosevelt and the Depression. But what I was looking for more than Roosevelt and the Depression was how they cooked, how they planted crops, how they grew crops, how they made clothes, how they made soap. In my house, we had my grandmother lived with us. She was an immigrant from Italy, a peasant woman, and she spoke only Italian. So we had a lot of ethnic traits in our household, making sausage and the like that we did. And my grandmother and my mom constantly were fighting with one another, as my mom wanted to be more American and grandma wanted to retain her Italian ethnicity. And so I was interested to see how that operated in the South. And the students went out and collected, and they hated it, as students often do, until they started to hear, because they had to tape record it and then transcribe it, they had to then listen. When you're doing the interview, I do a lot of oral history work now, subsequently. When you're doing the oral history interview, and when I do interviews, you're not always paying attention because you're looking for the next question, what next question you're going to ask. And since this was part of a classroom assignment, it was even more pronounced in the way they operated. So they were constantly trying to get to the next question, and they weren't paying attention to what grandma, grandpa, or a great uncle was talking about. But when they played it back and listened to it, they were just struck by the stories that they were being told. They made copies of it, and it became part of the family archive. And in student evaluation after student evaluation, they talked about how difficult of an assignment it was, but it was so valuable because now they know about their family and they know all about what it was like in the past, and they learned more from the oral history interview than they could ever learn from a boring old professor like myself, even though I was young but old to them, but now I'm ancient, so it all goes that way. And I had no research interest in this. It wasn't as though I were compiling data for some project. But as time went on, the stories just were too profound to ignore. You just can't let them sit. They were too good. The stories were just so uniform in how they presented themselves. One of the things I write in the book is when one or two people tell you these tall tales about, I had to walk up the hill both ways to school. We walked uphill to get to school and then we walked uphill to get home. When you hear that story once or twice, it's sort of colloquial and you laugh that this is some nostalgic recall. But when 400 people tell the same story in that way, it suggests something else, as though there's a larger message behind what they're trying to tell you. It's not a literal understanding. And that's one of the things I like about oral history, because it plays hard and fast with the rules of history, because it's not an objective study. It's not a scientific thing. It's a subjective one. Because often what they're trying to present to you in the stories, and you read them, if you read the book, you read the stories, is they're telling you a message, a story within the story. So it's not literal, they walked uphill both ways. It's figurative. They're trying to explain to the listener how difficult it was, and it's difficult to convey that to a young kid some 40 years younger, 50 years younger than yourself. The difficulty of growing up during the Great Depression, because it's really hard for us to imagine. Just as it's hard for us to imagine what it would be like in World War II or what it would be like in the 1950s, it's difficult to understand that. And what oral history allows, it allows them the room to talk and legitimize their experiences. And I told the students as they went out into the field, I gave them the methodological advice and taught them how to do oral history. And I gave them 6 basic techniques, basic rules to follow. The first, and this comes from a book by a fellow by the name of Paul Thompson, by the way. And all of you, if you don't do oral history or talk to other people and get their stories down, you should, particularly young people, but also us older folks. We can still talk to even older people and find out what their life was in the past. Anybody can do it, and you should. I regret that I didn't do it with my grandmother because I don't know how to cook all the cool things she used to cook growing up. All strange Italian things, but they were delicious. And my mom, of course, never wanted to learn how to do it because it was too, ethnic. So she doesn't know anything. So I don't know because I never interviewed. But I did do my dad before he passed, and I've done my mom, and I've done my various in-laws in my travels. So I think it's really good as a family history to get it down on tape and then videotape. Now I have it all on DVD. It's a really good way to retain connection with your family. But I gave them 6 techniques for this directed conversation. And the first one is, it was most important, and that's give the people the voice. Let them tell their story. You're not there to be Barbara Walters or to be an interviewer to try and get the truth, because the truth was relative to their experience. And so allow them the voice. And so I designed questions that were open-ended enough so that they can tell stories, as opposed to, yes, Roosevelt was a great man. Why was Roosevelt a great man? Well, because he did really good things for us. Well, I'm leading you into the question, and rather than lead you into the question, I just leave it open-ended. What do you remember best about the Great Depression? What do you remember about Franklin Roosevelt? And that way, they could tell whatever story they want in relation to it. And giving them voice allows them to have, and this is number 2, the space to operate. So you don't interject every 2 minutes with, oh, really, tell me more. No, you give facial signals, you do body movement, you do things that encourage them to continue to speak without interjecting constantly, because you want them to get into flow. And oftentimes they'll start telling stories that on the surface don't connect, but after a while they get right back on the path and they've told you something really, really interesting about your family or about a situation that occurred, and you get that little nugget, that little gem that you were looking for in the first place. So voice, and then power, and then power is the third one, because it transfers the power. When you interview somebody, immediately the interviewee wants to satisfy the interviewer. I want to tell you what you want to know. Just like you invited me to come and speak before you, I want to tell you something that you can take away. I have this desire to satisfy your needs. And you're giving me the space to try and do that, to let me talk, and you're not interrupting with question after question after question. We'll have a question time later, and you can interrupt me then all you like. So I'm allowed to just sort of ramble on, as I do in my classroom, and eventually we get to some point. And that's the transfer of power that takes place in an oral history interview between the interviewer and the interviewee. Allow the person speaking to have the power to direct the conversation. And that's how it operated. The fourth one is make sure you're enjoying it. Make it fun. There's nothing worse than being interviewed by someone, and as they're interviewing you, they have just the most dour look on their face you can imagine. It's like, well, am I boring you? Have I done something wrong? Have I said a word improperly? Make sure you're enjoying it and interact with that person in that nonverbal way so that they know that the experience is good for you as it is for them. And five, allow for follow-up questions. Let them tell their story, and as they're telling their story, write down something that would be a relevant follow-up question, and then ask them another question. And what happens after a while in this interview style is they'll start telling stories, and literally you can't stop them. They'll just keep going and going and going, and all you have to do is gently get them on the road every now and then. They'll just keep talking for as long as you want. And then after an hour, when the tape runs out, and nowadays my students have digital cameras, and they do it with digital cameras. The camera will stop, and they'll keep talking. And they'll say, stop. I have to change the tape. I have to put another tape in, because once they get on a roll and they feel the power, when you begin to empower the interviewee, it's very difficult to stop them. And it's a wonderful experience for both the student and for the person being interviewed. They feel legitimized by it. And last is be understanding. This is a person you're asking to share their past with, their life. You're asking them to open up. And so there are some things they may not want to talk about. And with the book, and with the students from Georgia, one of the more difficult issues to deal with was race. In the set of questions that I created, I didn't specifically create a question regarding race, but rather allowed the interviewee to self-identify. So there were questions that were related to race, but not specifically what were race relations like in the American South. And virtually all the interviews, however, did touch upon race. But what happened most of the times is both white and African American respondents chose to become silent when talking about race. And certainly there were, at least out of the 600, probably 50 to 70 who did discuss some aspect of race. But the great majority said, well, everybody knew where their place was, and nobody crossed the line, or something like that. Or, well, I never saw any black people in our community, which was difficult to imagine in rural Georgia. And then they tell a story right afterwards that they had tenant workers, or sharecroppers on their property. It's like, so there was always this uncomfortableness that came with discussing race. And I told the students after the first couple of quarters that we did it, they would tell me that, there's this uncomfortableness. And I said, well, don't pry. If they don't want to talk about it, it's not your job to make them feel anything about the past. They're sharing their past with you. They're sharing what they want to share. And if they don't want to discuss it, well, then there's really nothing we can do. This isn't an interrogation. It's an interview. And you want to hear about their past, not necessarily what makes them feel uncomfortable. But in the book, as you read, I do analyze this sense of uncomfortableness, this silence, which in oral history theory is very important. It's just as important, sometimes silence is just as important as the words they're saying, because it describes the context of their understanding, the consciousness that they have. And there was a lot of silence regarding the issue of race. And I'll talk a little bit more about race in a few minutes. But the stories were just so profound and so interesting. I'll read some stories for you, and that's what I'm going to do the rest of the time, is read you some stories, and then you could ask me questions, whatever you want. This is a story from a fellow by the name of Tom Skelton from around the Villa Rica area out west. I guess the main thing I remember, there were some hard times, but there were some good times too. But a lot of times we had to do without things. We had to do the best we could, like I've already said, with whatever we had. But we learned how to cope and how to make the best of what we had, and we really didn't suffer that much. Now, some people did, but I don't remember ever suffering because of it. I can remember doing without a lot of things, and this is key, but that was just part of living, and we had a good time. People enjoyed being together. I think people were friendlier and were closer because of that sort of thing, you know. And that brings up some of the general theme of the book and in the stories that they told. And I wasn't selective in which stories I used in the book. This was representative. In the introduction of the book, I talk about how these were the major themes in the book, and they were representative. And I could have just published all the oral histories, and you could have seen all of them, but it would have been a bigger book. And I wanted to keep it slim and inexpensive. I got it slim, but the press made it more. That wasn't my fault, just so you know. I don't. That's the press's responsibility. I have no responsibility for that. But nonetheless, and I wanted it to be accessible and readable. And this is representative of the type of story that's in the book, which is in the midst of their understanding of the crisis, there was a sense of hopefulness that even as the crisis was, we suffered, we didn't have a lot of stuff, we didn't have money to buy things, we didn't know anything about what was going on, we didn't have a radio, we worked and made very little money, it was difficult to eat, all the stories, but they would always interject somewhere in the story but people tended to get along because nobody had anything, and that was a constant theme. Nobody had anything, so there wasn't this desire to have more than the other. And again, you could say, well, they were being nostalgic, and they were. They were recalling the past in a warm and fuzzy way, but they were doing it as a message to the younger person that was doing the interview to them, to remind them of some of the hardships they had to go through to get to the place they were in then. And so they use these, what I call depression allegories, to sort of get at, the history of what happened. One of the themes that ran throughout most of the interviews, because it's about the Great Depression, was FDR and how they idolized FDR. And so I'll read you some of the stories about FDR. General stories. He didn't lie to us about the Great Depression. A fellow by the name of Brewer Douglas said. He said to the people, let's try it, let's make it work. Roosevelt put us on our way. And I don't know that he actually knew anything about Roosevelt, but he seemed to have an understanding of, the pragmatic nature of the New Deal. It wasn't a successful project in many aspects, but it was, let's try it. And so he enunciated it very accurately. What they all saw in Roosevelt was a real strong sense of hope. When he came into office, Joe Johnson said, people began to feel better, like better times were coming. While unable to cite exactly what Roosevelt ever said, he went on to say, Roosevelt was the one who gave everyone courage and hope in those days because at last somebody was going to do something. Somebody was going to get us on our feet so that we can get ahead. And Geraldine Beck, agreed with that, saying that Roosevelt restored confidence in the American government because he lifted the spirits, of the people. And those comments again and again come through. And they also talk about Roosevelt on the radio. And how, when Roosevelt was going to be on the radio, and Roosevelt used the radio a lot during the 1930s because he believed, and his press secretary believed, that the media, the press media, the print media was against him. And there was certainly some evidence to suggest that the print media was not as supportive of New Deal efforts as were others. And the federal government had control over radio with the FCC, and so Roosevelt was able to use his influence as president of the United States to force the radio, NBC Red and Blue and CBS, to get free radio time. So Roosevelt would go on the radio all the time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour long. And many of the New Deal programs also got free radio time, like the Federal Music Project and the WPA and the Federal Theater Project also got free radio time because of the federal control of the radio. And so Roosevelt was on the radio a lot, and the people remembered Roosevelt being on the radio, and they would liken his speeches and conversations on the radio and I'll read it, said, he would sit down and talk to you like daddy and tell his children, just stick with me because things are going to get better. And that's the way they recalled it. Again and again and again, you get this image of Roosevelt as a father figure sitting down, and they believed, and it's one of the things that, make you kind of smile, because they really believed he was sitting in his living room by a fire, talking to him just as they were sitting around, that they were part of the house. He became part of the family. Again and again and again, they relate how Roosevelt had become part of the family in their talking. Paul Morgan remembers that the whole family would sit around the radio and listen every time he had one. Hell, didn't anybody ever miss one? Bertha Hicks said that when it was announced Roosevelt was going to be on the radio, people that had radios would let everybody know when he was scheduled to speak, and then they would all go over to their person's house and listen very carefully to what he had to say. And it became part of it. This is one of my favorite ones. Travis Duro, he's from Alabama, from Leeds, Alabama. He said, everybody came to a sudden halt, and they were thrilled to hear his heart-to-heart talk with the people of the nation. He stated, he went on, he continued, he said, Republican people wouldn't even listen because he was so convincing that he would convert them. Right. And then Paul Maddox said, if he got on the radio and said, my countrymen, at 3 o'clock this afternoon, it will rain pennies from heaven, there would be 25 million people got out with pans to catch it. That's good. But then to follow up, and I think to put it in context, was a fellow from southern Georgia by the name of Joe Johnson. He said, I don't remember any of his words. That's important. I don't really remember any of his words, because when the follow-up questions the students asked were, what did he say on the radio? And overwhelmingly, I don't remember any of the words, but he was like a friend instead of a president talking to you. And that's sort of what the stories about Roosevelt came to be about, where he was more of like a friend than he was, the president. And it's something to remember that in the 1930s, Roosevelt was the first president that people really heard. Radio was a relatively new technology, and while Hoover had utilized it somewhat between 1928 and 1932, it wasn't part of his active agenda. It was still in its early network phase. NBC Blue and Red hadn't yet established permanent network hookups. CBS was still in its infancy at that time. So it was a relatively new market, and Roosevelt tapped it early with the advice of his press secretary, Stephen Early. And for most Americans, it was the first time they've ever heard a president speak. And I found it very interesting that these rural Georgians, and even Georgians from Atlanta and smaller towns, would find themselves associating with Roosevelt, somehow understanding him. Because if you ever listen to Roosevelt talk, he sounds like Mr. Howell from Gilligan's Island. That's what I always tell my students. Now we have modern technology in the classroom, and I get on the computer in my classroom and I play some of Roosevelt's speeches, and he sounds so New England. He just sounds so New England. It's difficult for me to imagine how rural Southerners, who speak a little bit different, would listen and say, that he's like one of the family. Good Lord, he's way a Yankee. He's way a Yankee. So, but they did. They came to see him as a father figure, a savior. A lot of them, and most of them called him, like this one, the greatest president we ever knew. He took politics out of managing the people. We loved him, honey. If you didn't like Roosevelt, she said, this is Bessie Bird's song, if you didn't like Roosevelt, you better not say anything about it, because they'd be somebody ready to fight you. So he just had widespread support. And it was because it was the first time that people really got a chance to hear the president on the radio. And the president, and Roosevelt, even with his Yankee accent, Roosevelt was able to get his message across, which was, I'm here to help you. I'm not exactly sure what we're doing, and we're going to try our best. And it was always we. Roosevelt always said we, rarely said I in the pronouns. So now I'm going to read you some other stories. This is a good story. This is Alan Furline. He told his interviewer how proud he was getting a job making 50 cents a day. And this is that interview technique of just letting the person talk, because he paused, and you could hear it on the tape. And I was so proud of my student, because rather than jumping in and saying another question, which a lot of them would do at that point and stop the flow, he paused, and Furline takes this big, deep breath, and he says, let me tell you how I got the job. And this is in Athens, Alabama. And there was no work to be had, And he finds out they're building a road. It's a WPA project. And he goes and he says, hey, you're building a road. I need a job. I don't have a job. I don't have any money. I don't have food, And the foreman says, sorry, I can't hire. They come out of the office in town. You go sign up. Maybe you can get put on a project and we can give you a job. And he said, well, I don't want to go downtown. I need a job today. The foreman says, well, I can't help you. And so what Furline does, he just grabs a shovel and he starts working on the road. And the foreman, I'm not paying you, man. Go home. And Furline tells him, when the boss returned, he told me I better leave because he didn't have any money to pay me. He cursed at me and told me I'd better get out of here or I'm going to beat him up. Well, he didn't have anywhere to go. And he showed up the next day earlier than any other worker and grabbed a tool and started working before anybody showed up. The foreman shows up and says, go home. I don't have any money to pay you. He does this all week long. Every day. He runs up ahead so the foreman won't take the shovel away from him. The pick one day, a hoe another day. He just wants to work. Finally, it comes on Saturday, and the foreman said, okay, I'm going to pay you for the week, but whatever you do, don't come back. Don't come back. He went back on Monday, and he worked another week, so he got to work 2 weeks, and then the project moved to another county, so he couldn't follow it. And that's how he got a job. He was so proud that for 2 weeks he was making that much, 50 cents a day, and that was what he remembers best about the Depression. And you could just imagine the impact that made on his interviewer, where, you were running ahead of them so that they wouldn't steal your shovel, so you could build a road. It's just really interesting. One of the things that I learned while going through the interviews was the difference between female and male responses. Men and women have different ways of framing things. Men in interviews usually talk with the personal pronoun I. I did this, I did that, I did this. Women always said we, always used the plural, and always referenced the family, and always saw themselves in a different life. Whatever they were doing for the family. Whereas men were, they were very much focused on themselves. I analyze it better in the book in a more cogent way, but that's basically what it comes down to. For women in the Great Depression, as you may know, women found themselves having to work oftentimes, and this begins the tendency of something called the second shift. A sociologist by the name of Arlie Hawksfield, is that her name? Starts talking about Arlie Hawkschild talks about the second shift, where women work in a real job all day and then have to come home and take care of the household and raise the children and cook the food and do all the cleaning. And men, in interview after interview after interview, they never ever considered working all day and then coming home and helping out at home, even though their wives were working all day in the textile mill or in the fields or whatever they were doing, trying to earn money. They came home and they didn't do it. It was almost a given that they would work outside the home. For Pearl Johnson, she worked in the fields all day long with her sharecropper husband, and she had babies. And her job was to take care of the babies and also work in the field, do all the same labor that her husband did, as well as cook and clean the house. Olga Ragsdale worked with her husband at Gulf Oil right here in Atlanta as a filing clerk. And when they came home, they would commute back and go home. She would cook supper and do her house chores and go to bed and get up early the next day and pack lunches and get everything ready. And when her husband, he was sitting there at the interview, they were interviewed together, was asked, what did he do? And he goes, well, in those days, men weren't supposed to do any work, which she didn't. She laughed. You could hear the laughter on the tape. Yeah, that's the way it was. One woman, an interesting story, it was Maggie Jones. Her husband died in the mid-1930s in Heflin, Alabama, and she had no means of support. There was no public service to help her. She had 3 kids, small town in Alabama, and so what she would do in order to make ends meet is she and her kids would go to the outskirts of town, out in the woods in the outskirts of town, and dig up ornamental shrubbery that they found in the outskirts of town, in the forests, in the woods, in the abandoned property, and bring them into town and plant them around churches, and then go to the pastor or the minister and say, I beautified your church. She didn't have a contract. She'd do it and then go and say, doesn't it look pretty? It looks nicer now that there's a couple shrubs in front of your sign or along the walkway. Look at the new flowers, which she would just get from abandoned fields. And she became a gardener, and that's how she supported her family all the way through the Great Depression. And after she told this heartbreaking story, to her interviewer. The interviewer obviously was astounded by, like, wow, that just seems so hardcore. You know, you were out there working for nothing and then asking for something afterwards. And she said, oh, well, it was a hard time, but everybody had a hard time. And see, again, she wasn't a hero or anything like that. She was just somebody who worked hard and liked working hard. So women had a different perspective. There was also, as I mentioned earlier, a different perspective regarding race, and I'll read you two examples of how a white and an African American viewed the situation. And these are exemplary of how the responses came about. The first one is from a white respondent. The color of one's skin, didn't matter back in them days. They stayed in their place and we stayed in ours. But the interviewer was one of my better students. He pushed a little bit further. In fact, he interviewed 3 people that same day, and the interviews are really interesting. But the interviewer wasn't satisfied, and he asked if there was any sense of superiority or dominance, kind of pushed the guy, who was his grandfather, actually, so it worked. He replied no, and said, the colored didn't try to go in with the whites. They stayed in their place, and they knew where they could go. Some were able to get jobs, to cook and take care of houses, but we were all poor and got along back in those days. Then interviewers, let him stop, and there was a big pause, and he said, well, what would happen if they crossed the line and didn't stay in their place? It's a fair question. And he replied, his name is Woodrow Maffett, he replied, they would get stopped. And then that was the end of that. And he asked him another question. He goes, we're not going to talk about that anymore. And that was the end of it. He then interviewed, the same student interviewed another friend of his grandfather, and his friend was willing to be open a little bit more about it. He said, well, they had to depend on the white man because they didn't have anything, and to survive they had to work on the land for whatever wages were available, and they had to accept it because they had no other choices. And so when they got stopped, they got stopped. There were no choices. William Gordon, an African American from Bullard City, Georgia, he was one of the few African Americans that answered and talked in detail about being black in Georgia and rural Georgia at the time. And he said, leaned back in his chair and he responded to a question. The question was a general question, didn't have to deal with race. It said, what was the mood of the country in the 1930s? He said, well, men and women could barely live. They had to work for the white folk. And he would, my mom, he said, my mother would work at a white folks' house and bring home the food they had left over to feed the family. And that's what she got paid. And that's how they lived. And and then he got quiet too. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. That was all he needed to say. He didn't tell any more stories. He just wanted to go on to something else about how things opened up in the latter part of the Depression. And you get this sense of this hidden history that's part of it. That's still part of the segregation experience. I teach up in Ohio, and about 5 years ago, my students and I, we did a video documentary with black residents of Warren, Ohio, which is a medium-sized industrial city outside of Youngstown, where I teach in Warren. And we talked to them about the 1950s, what it was like in Warren in the 1950s, and we captured it on video. And the similar stories came through, because they also interviewed whites in Warren at the time, and the same type of silence was present on both sides, and it became a documentary and was aired on PBS, and was really quite an event, both for me and for the people who were interviewed. So race and oral history is a really interesting new field. Trying to understand the context of race in America using oral history is something that's pretty new and exciting, and it still operates. Most of what they talked about that I like to put in the book, one of the chapters on Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal program, another chapter's on consumption. And this is an interesting chapter, too. The chapter deals with their understanding that they were undergoing a profound change of consciousness. The 1930s is the reformation of consciousness that's taking place. And one of the shifts that is occurring is this shift from home-produced goods to produced goods outside of the home and consumed in the home. And oftentimes, historians of the South tend to ignore that process, and it's only been in the last 15 or so years that Southern historians have begun to look at how rural communities accepted and adapted to this change from having like a rolling store that would come through the community every now and then to a permanent department store in a small town where they would do all their grocery shopping or shopping at want to get a department store clothes and stuff along that line. So a lot of them took that opportunity to talk about their folkways and foodways, about how they prepared foods before they had to buy everything, because they're talking to their grandkids or their great grandkids or a young person by their comparison, who buy all their food at the Piggly Wiggly out in western Georgia. It's probably now what do you all have down here? Harris Teeter and Kroger and the like. And so they told a lot of stories, and they told a lot of stories about a type of meat I'd never heard of called streakoline. Streakoline, all right. Most of the meat you can get back then was this old streakoline. We didn't have any way of keeping meat. They didn't have these freezers and all that, and when you killed a hog, it had to be in cold weather. We would salt the meat and lay it overnight. You had a big old meat box. We'd pack that meat and put down a layer of salt and a layer of meat. Most of the time, you had to take the backbone and spare ribs and cook all that up in jars and can it. You'd fry your sausage and patties and pack these 1/2 gallon fruit jars with sausage, pour in grease and all. It was good. I always say it was good. Boil that backbone and pull that meat off the bone and pack it in those jars, and it was good meat. And then to make sauerkraut. I never knew how to make sauerkraut. I learned so much in reading these oral histories. It was such a blast. To make sauerkraut, I just thought it was cabbage cut up, and you put a little wine vinegar in, and you go, no. Some of us would go and take the cabbage from the garden. We go through the process of getting them ready, quartering them up and getting the center part out. Then you'd put them in a container. It was an apparatus that was made from a hoe. You'd curve it out in an S shape, and it was sharpened on the edge of it, and you put a handle on top. You'd put those cabbage quarters in this container and then take this thing and start chopping the cabbages up. When you got the cabbages chopped up, now that's a man speaking up to that point. Now here's his, he doesn't know what happens from this point. The women would do something to that. The women would do something to that. It's a magic incantation, apparently. And then they'd put it in a churn and process it, and then it would be kraut. It was like pickles. That's what it was. When you got to that stage, they'd take it from the container and they'd put it on the stove, and a big pan on top of a wood-fired stove. They'd cook it to a certain degree, and then they would can it, and then they would preserve it for the winter. So all he knew about was making the S-handle thing. The rest of it was all magic. It was all magic. Poor man sausage. Steve Deering, this is a story. This is a good one, too. They ate a lot of, I'll read. We ate buttered cornbread and syrup a lot of times for breakfast. Back then, they'd raise these whippoorwill peas, they called them, these little speckled peas, and we'd eat them 3 times a day. We'd eat them at lunch and at supper time. And if she had any left, she'd mash them up and put sage and peppers and things and fry them up for sausage. You couldn't hardly tell the difference between that and real sausage. We just had it so hard, but it was so good. Again, that difference between them. What's this one? Social occasions. Candy pools. They all talked about pulling taffy. Always. Because one of the questions I asked was, what did they do for entertainment? Because, again, from the North, I had a certain vision of what entertainment was in the 1930s based on earlier research, and I wanted to know what rural Southerners did. And one of the big entertainment things they did was they'd get together and pull taffy, because apparently they raised a lot of cane sugar or sorghum, sugar, what's it called? Fluid. Molasses, thank you. Fluid, that's what I came up with, fluid. Gosh, yeah, I have a PhD, fluid. Molasses is what it was, very good. And here, I'll read it, because I never knew how to do it, and I was amazed. And again, it wasn't like 1 or 2 people talked about these candy pulls, or it was just white people, or it was white and black would talk about the candy pulls, and they talked about it in such the spirit of this was a community. People would get together and they'd pull candy, whether it be a church or a community event, or you just invite neighbors over to the house. So this is a fellow by the name of John Gillespie. You would cook it. You would cook sugar and boil it until it got to a certain degree, and then you would choose a partner, which was usually this girl, and you would go out there and you would get a bunch of that stuff in a ball, and you'd start twisting it like elastic and just keep on and keep stretching it until you get it out to like you wanted it, and you would twist it about a half turn and lay it on a table, and it would get hard. It was like we called stick candy now. You would take something and break it and chew it. Sugar candy was what it was, really. When you got it, it would be like chewing gum. Then you and your partner would just start pulling at it, and you would twist it and pull it and twist it and pull it, and it would just keep stretching like elastic until you got it as long as you wanted, and then you would give it about a half turn. I don't know why you gave it that half turn. I guess to make it look pretty, I reckon. Then you laid it on the table and let it get cold, and it would be hard, and that was all the candy you had. So you could hear him telling the story as the student was watching him going, what are you talking about? You take sugar? So he tells the same story twice again and again and again. You could just hear how he does it. And again, there are a number of those types of stories at Candy Pull. There's another one. Making soap. And this amazed the students more than anything else because it just boggles their mind to know that soap is made from fat, animal fat, and from ashes from the fireplace. They would listen to these stories and just say, no, that's just not right. That's not true. You're kidding me. Yeah, we made, this was the question, I made lots of soap. Yeah, we made lye in the soap out of ashes dripped. You'd fix an old barrel and save your ashes through the winter, and then in the spring you would take and pour water in the barrel of ashes, and it'd drip down and make lye. What's the gender of the person saying this? That's a woman, because men will have no idea how to make lye. They know how to use the soap, but they don't know how to make it. The woman knew how to make the soap. That'd make lye. And then you'd put in a pot with some grease, put water and grease from pork primarily, and you'd make it. And then all that old grease you would save all winter long. And, the old fat meat you couldn't use, they'd put that in there and you'd turn it into soap. You'd mix the two up. And you'd cut it into bars of soap. And it would just make the clothes look so pretty and clean. Now here's a man saying it. Oh, we made our own soap and everything. Pride. You would use what we called pot ashes. We'd empty ashes out of the fireplace, and then we'd buy something, I don't know, some kind of chemical to put in it. And then we'd boil it, and then you let it get cold, and you cut it into bars. It'd take the hide off you when you were getting a bath. I don't know what time it is. I don't ram it all. All right. I don't know what time I started, so if I'm running along too long, give me a sign. 5 more minutes? All right. A couple more stories in. Oh, folk remedies. This is another good one. In the stories that they said going to the doctor was the kiss of death. Yeah, you only went to the doctor if you were about to die. And if the doctor had to be called to your house, that wasn't a good thing. And so most of the remedies were done at home. And with natural things that they found in and around their homes, at least with the rural folk. If you got really burned, I'm quoting a fellow by the name of John Knight, or Guy Knight rather. If you got really burned bad, we'd go out in the woods and find these bamboo briars. And you'd get the leaves off and take them home, and Mama would make a salve out of them. I got scars on me right now because I was melting a piece of rubber one time, and it dropped on my hand. If you got cut real bad or anything, Mama would just run and get some old spider webs and soot out of the chimney or wherever and stick it on there. And your scar would always turn out black when it healed up. It was black because of the soot, but it stopped that bleeding. And we always had bad nosebleeds. Most of us did. They tell you to stick a pair of scissors down your back and lay them down behind the back, and that's supposed to stop it. And you might laugh at it because apparently the student did. But 9 times out of 10, your nose would stop bleeding. That was good enough. This was a story Isabel Hester told her granddaughter about. Her granddaughter asked her about how her mom was born. Tell me about how Mama was born, that type of thing. Well, my first child was born in 1933. The doctor stayed there 2 nights and gave me all kinds of medication to stop the pain. So there was this fellow that lived up on Old Georgia State Route 27 going up toward Clem by the name of Cheyenne Morgan. He was a bootlegger, and my doctor, Dr. Otto, and my husband's name was Brian. The doctor told Brian, I've given her all the medication I can give her. You go see Cheyenne Morgan and get her some whiskey. So he went to the people we were living with, and they got a mule. Again, they got a mule and went up Highway 27 to Cheyenne Morgan. And Cheyenne Morgan gave him a Coca-Cola bottle full of it. He told them what he wanted it for because he knew my husband didn't drink, and he didn't make him pay for it. She was very important to state that. Your grandpa didn't drink, and we didn't pay for that liquor. I don't know how much he gave me, but he sweetened it and put some water in it, and I drank it, and she was born about 20 minutes after. Then her father-in-law, then his daddy, Byron's father, came in after she was born and turned up that Coca-Cola bottle and drank every drop of it. Byron told him, "Dad, I got that for medicine." "Well, you can get some more." His daddy was bad to drink. We didn't have no medicine. This is Bernita Reed. We didn't have no medicine, just castor oil and turpentine, and this old black drought. Y'all don't know nothing about that. When my children would get colds, I'd call them, and her father, the interviewer's father, Harvey hid. He'd always try to run and hide. He'd fly. Sometimes he'd get out and run down across the field. I'd give him so much. Well, that was all we had. Yeah, that's what I had to do to help the children. Castor oil, and put me 2 or 3 drops of turpentine in it. You could come to the store and get a box of black drought. It wouldn't cost but $0.25. We kept some of it all the time. Harvey, he'd run and hide. He took so much of it. He'd see me with that bottle, and down across the field he'd go. Nah, we didn't have no medicine. I guess they might have had a drugstore, but we wasn't able to buy it. A lot of folks wasn't. There was a herb down in the woods. I don't see none of it now. I guess it got plowed up or dying out or something. We called it scurvy grass. People used to go out and get it. A lot of us used to go fishing and come down through the woods and dig up some scurvy grass and carry it home and wash all the dirt and grit off it. Then we tie it up and hang it up. It was like a laxative, and it was also good for colds. You boil some in water, pour over it, and steam it and drink it. And that's what they did for medicine. So that was that. And let's go to, okay, this is a couple more. This is a good one about diapers. We didn't know what a disposable diaper was. See how she's making it culturally specific. Mothers in this day and time don't know what it is to have babies and have to wash diapers. Scrub them on a board, put them on a wash pot, and boil them. Then you would have this big cloth bag, a cloth flour bag, and we'd wash that and make something out of it for the kids, or dish towels or something like that. Guano, fertilizer, used to come out in cloth bags, and we'd take that and make things. And it used to be guano would come in coarse white bags, because of course the girls look at her and say, "What are you talking about? It's fertilizer bags you're making clothes out of." So she'd repeat it again and again. And you didn't have beds like you do now. We had a straw bed, and you'd take shucks, corn husks, and you'd make your own mop. You'd have boards with holes in it, and you'd put shucks in them through, and that's what you had to do. We didn't have linoleum. We just had to scrub the floor. It wouldn't take long, You would use that same old board. Just take out the old shucks and put some new ones in. It would last a good long time. And we didn't have washing powders like you have now. We'd take white sand and put it on the floors to scrub the floors, and it would look pretty and make them white too. And that's what they did. And they didn't have a vacuum cleaner. She wasn't done. We didn't have this either. We didn't have a vacuum cleaner or a carpet sweeper. Nothing. So what we did was we tore wet newspapers and tore them into strips and put them on the rug, and then we swept them up. See, that kept the dust down. When we got all the paper swept, the rug was nice and clean. And I've tried that, and it does work. So I've tried that, and it does work. More stories, but I'm going to just end with one last one. The book is filled with stories like this, and, it's really interesting to read. But I think the Depression learned people a thing, said this man from western Georgia. I think after the Depression, it learned people to appreciate what they had more. What they didn't, they got, and what they already had. And I don't think it just changed the people on all the way around everything. Things happened that never happened before that made you appreciate it. And in all, I think it was a big change for the whole world. About that time, everybody began to bloom out and have lots more. So there's a real conception amongst these people that the Depression changed the way they saw the world. And that's my basic argument in the book, is that the Depression is this reformation of consciousness where they begin to see things differently. The regional differences between Northerners and Southerners begin to break down, for example, as a result of the CCC and WPA projects, NYA, other projects where the government is moving people around. World War II is going to accelerate the process, certainly, but the foundation is laid in the Great Depression. And as these regional differences begin to dissipate, it leads to this idea that everybody's sort of in it together. And you heard it earlier when I talked about Roosevelt in the fireside chats or the times on the radio. There was a real conception that everybody was part of the recovery, everybody was part of the Depression. As opposed to saying, oh, folks in the North or the Yankees in the North. There were very few stories that blamed anybody in the North or the West, or blame bankers or stockbrokers. It was almost, they all accepted the responsibility both for the Depression and for the cure. And it was this sense of hope and this sense of sacrifice that really resounds in these people's voices. And that's the reason why I use their words rather than, as a scholar, I could have taken all their words and scrutinized it and used a methodological lens to take all of the meaning out of it. But what I chose to do, very consciously chose to do, is let their words tell the story. So this is a book about their words, and I just simply arranged it sort of like a carpet weaver. Just put it together so that it tells you the story. So we'll open it up for questions. Thank you for sitting through my storytelling. So any questions you have, thank you. That's sweet. So if you have a question, we'll talk about it. Or if you have stories that you want to share, please feel free to share your stories as well.
What was the racial makeup of your class here in Georgia, and how did those kids feel about each other?
When I was at West Georgia from 89 to 94, the racial mix-up was predominantly, overwhelmingly white. There weren't a lot of black students at the campus. They were, I don't know, there's a fellow West Georgian alum here. I don't know, but it was pretty small. I would say no more than 10% of the student body was African American. So in any particular class, there might be one or two or maybe three. And so in terms of the total number of interviews, racial mixture of the interviews, it was predominantly white, which was a problem later on. But again, it wasn't done as a social scientific experiment, and I wasn't trying to create, my sociologist would have a problem with this because my, database wasn't correct, that type of thing. But,
I remember that I grew up at that time on the turpentine still. I don't know if you know what turpentine still is. But in northwest Florida, just near Tallahassee. And I remember all of that. We were one of the only white family on the block. So all my friends and playmates were black, and I thought nothing of it at that time. And then I also know about the chronicle and the spider whales,
right.
and all of that stuff. And also, then I was
What's turpentine made with?
art.
How do you make turpentine? For the folks that don't know how to make turpentine. How do you make turpentine? How'd they make it?
It's from a pine tree.
Okay.
Pine tree is get gum, and then they take the gum and boil it,
Right.
and then put it in barrels and ship it to the city.
Right. I'll bet you there are people in here who didn't know that, though. My point is, I bet you there are people who didn't know that. Yeah.
They don't have it. They had it in South Georgia.
Yeah, Piney Woods. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But that's the way I grew up as a child. I was turpentine. Then when I finished school, I moved to Tallahassee. Then I got in the MYA program.
Oh, really?
I went to in Ocala, Florida. They had a school that they taught mechanics and secretarial and even pilot training, all of that, and they made so much of it. And then the war came along, and I went to Washington.
Wow.
If you could breathe and type, you could go to war.
Right. So quite a change in 10 years. 10 years of your life.
Yes, it was.
Wow.
And I lived in Washington all and worked during the war. And I just retired a few months ago.
Wow. Good for you. Yes, sir.
You were talking about fertilizer a while ago, and you called it wallow.
I'm sorry. I mispronounced it, didn't I? Guana, all right.
They would say it with a southern accent.
How would they say it?
Guyana.
Guyana? Oh, all right.
They would call it wallow.
I don't call it guana.
What you talking about?
Well, language is a code. We have to figure it out as best we can. Yeah.
When you interviewed your own family, what questions did you ask?
There's a different approach if you're interviewing family members because you're looking for a more of what's called a life narrative approach. And again, Paul Thompson is really the source to go to that. It's THOMPSON. And he gives a really good method by which to do a life narrative, where you start with where were they born, what year they were born, get all the details out. And then you ask them to start talking about their parents. What do you know about your mom? Well, tell me some stories. And then you just start letting them tell stories. And you ask them, Where'd you live when you were a little kid? What kind of foods? I'm always focused on foodways because I just love to eat and I love to cook. And I love to hear stories about how people prepare foods. And, you know, you ask your family, your grandmother, your mother, about how they cooked. And from there, you get all these other stories that begin to come out. Because then you say, well, what do you mean you had to, you know, my grandmother would tell stories about how she would get chickens, whole chickens. I was like, well, what do you mean whole chickens? And she'd talk about how she'd spin their neck and crack their neck and, you know, do all the things that are necessary to get the chicken ready to eat. And I'm like, what? You know, she had, my grandmother, when I was young, we used to eat this meal. I don't remember the name of it in Italian, but it was just so good. And it was with fettuccine noodles and with olive oil and some garlic, and it was delicious. And later, as we grew more literate in Italian, we realized it was lamb's brains. And we would never eat it. You know, from that point forward, we never ate it again. It's like, oh my gosh, Graham, you're feeding us lamb's brains. What's wrong with you? But it was so good until we figured out what it was, you know. But from that, you know, from that story, you hear also her peasant background, where she grew up. You know, you didn't throw lamb's brains away. That was a delicacy. She would get so mad at us because, you know, the butcher was going to throw it away because it wasn't, you know, she couldn't afford lamb chops. So she could afford lamb brains because the butcher would throw them out and she'd cook them. My mother would just have a fit. Sir.
Going back to your interviews, I was sort of curious. You were saying the silence. Mm-hmm. Most of the interviews were, I would assume, whites in the South.
Primarily,
yeah. Because when I interviewed my family, there was no problem at all finding out about race.
Well, there's two things. I agree with you, and I hear exactly what you're saying. I'm sorry, I'm going to step back to the microphone. What happens when you're asking questions specifically about race, there is an opening up of it. For the Warren residents that we did a project with in Ohio, the questions were about being in Warren and being African American in Ohio. And the people that we interviewed were extremely open about it because this was their moment to shine. This was their moment to tell the truth. This was their moment to, we called the project Out of the Shadows, because what they did is they came out of the shadows of Warren. And again, the project wasn't designed for a documentary. It wasn't designed for any research. We just wanted the students who were white interviewing African Americans in Warren. We wanted them to know what it was like to be African American in this era of the 1950s. They had read a series of books on segregation, housing segregation in the North at the time too. And so they went in prepared to, and the African American respondents just gave us just so much great information. This project wasn't about race, so the question wasn't about that, and there were no questions that directly targeted that. And so it was more, I left the interview more up to the individual person, the interviewee, to talk about what they felt was important about the Great Depression. In hindsight, I wish I had loaded more questions in it that would have investigated the issue of racial diversity in the South, but I didn't.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I wondered if it was also who was doing the interview, because people I'm talking about, we were not really addressing race, except obliquely, like, why didn't you move to Tampa?
Right.
Well, it's because it was 10th grade, and there were no, you couldn't go down to 10th grade, so.
Had to go to the city, to go to the city school.
Or a conversation about how they moved to school.
And again, that's what I mean. When you're interviewing someone and you leave that space open, all sorts of things come out of it that you really weren't looking for. And it's like, now I see all those things. The number of African American students at West Georgia was so small in my classes that there was never really a critical mass that allowed for that space to open. So of the interviews where they identified themselves as being black in it, it's just probably less than 10%. And so you really never get a real critical understanding of what's going on. Again, in hindsight, I wish I had loaded it like a social scientist, but I didn't. I was a humanist. Yes, sir. Right.
But he felt for his mother, especially as he got older and had children. My gosh, what did he go through? So it seems like if you're an adult trying to feed a family, you see a lot different perspective than if you were a young man, gee, going fishing tomorrow, and day after speak over to the
Right.
family. So it seems that from if you're looking at it, and this applies to many other things, from the perspective, what are your responsibilities in a particular situation? I think you would have significantly different responses.
I'll answer it in three ways. First, there's an excellent book by a fellow by the name of Gene Elder called Children of the Depression, where he did a significant amount of oral history, interviews, and letter writing with children who survived the Depression. And they described what it was like to be a child during the Great Depression. And you're right, it's a different dynamic as a child. For this book, none of the people who are used in the book, one of the qualifications in doing the interview is they had to interview somebody who was born before 1922. So all of the interviews in the book, I pushed it back to 1920 so that they had to be at least 15 years old or so by 1935. And so oftentimes they had difficulty separating. In the South, the Depression really began to happen in the mid-1920s. And so they'd start telling stories about themselves in the 20s, and then they'd say, and in 1933 I got married and started having kids, and then the stories become much more about responsibility and the difficulty of working in the fields, of getting a job, of working full-time, and, trying to make ends meet. So there is a difference between the two, between children and adults, and you're right. But for this book, most of the respondents, if not all the respondents, were at least teenagers or young adults by the time of the Great